Well, hello everybody. Welcome to our panel, The Love Connection, Leveraging IoT and Strategy and Engagement in a New Energy World. My name is Dylan Lockwood. I'm the online content editor at Z Prime. Happy to have you all here today. We're talking about IoT today, but we're not just going to sit up here and say, well, IoT is good for your business, because you know that already. But when you're talking about the new energy world and leveraging technology, you have to think about what that's going to look like and how we can utilize those technologies to make that future better for everybody, for businesses, for utilities, for customers, and hopefully the planet while we're at it. And so because of that, we're gonna have questions directed at our panelists. We're also very open to having a dialogue. So we'll have a dedicated Q&A section at the end. But if at any time during the presentation something pops into your mind, just please raise your hand and we'll try and get to you. We want this to kind of be an open forum a bit. So there are four main points that we're going to want to hit throughout the course of this panel, and those are mainly that what are the factors that are slowing down the rate of adoption of technologies that can enable new energy solutions? How do we accelerate that rate of adoption? What kinds of partnerships are necessary to drive the sort of change we want to see? And what needs to change about the role of the utility and of the customer in these relationships, and of course other businesses as well, to create a viable ecosystem for our energy future. So before we delve into all of that, we're gonna go down the line. Start with you, Eric, and just give yourselves a short introduction.
Sure. So good afternoon. My name is Eric Bradley. I'm with Shell New Energies. I run the Connected Energy division. Connected Energy is a 2-year-old division of Shell New Energies, and we focus on behind-the-meter solutions or customer-premised solutions for commercial, industrial, communities, and municipalities, doing it in a number of countries around the world. And we work very closely with our retail business where we have it, and our trading and marketing business around the globe. And then in some cases, depending on what we're offering as a solution, we can bring in other parts of the traditional Shell business, like aviation and fuels and lubricants.
Excellent. Well, with the term Love Connection, I feel like I should say I'm bachelor number 2. I don't know if you want to take bachelor number 3 there, Jim. That's good. No, I'm Tom Willey. I'm the CEO of Blue Pillar. You probably have never heard of Blue Pillar. You may not have heard of Blue Pillar, but
I have.
Eric has, certainly, and maybe a few others in the audience. But Blue Pillar is a company that fundamentally is, our vision is rooted in one major belief, and that is if the last 20 years of the quote-unquote utility space was focused on the grid side and smart grid, so to speak, the next 20 years is going to be focused on the customer side and what happens at the meter and into the facility. And if that is something that resonates with you, then the very first thing you're going to recognize, like we have, is that every single new energy service, new energy application, new distributed energy resource, new microgrid, everything that you want to accomplish in that facility is going to require data and control over something in that facility that the customer has already installed, may have already been put in, or that you may be installing as a service provider. And Blue Pillar specifically focuses on how to connect all of that stuff that is not utility protocols. It's customer-sided equipment and systems. How do you connect that at economics that allow for these new services and capabilities to be economically positive ROIs? And we consider ourselves an IoT company, but in essence, we build networks behind the meter so that people like Shell can go and offer new services without having to worry about getting the data in the first place.
Very good. I can't beat that dating, so you might want to just pick him. I'm CEO of VEIC. I'm also a recovering chief customer officer from a utility, National Grid. So I've seen kind of both sides of it. VEIC is a customer-side utility in Vermont. We're a customer-side utility in DC. We also run a consulting business, Hawaii, Wisconsin, Ohio, so we have a pretty broad footprint, all focused on customer-side solutions. We have about 75 engineers that are all behind-the-meter engineers that are doing all kinds of different work across the country.
So Eric, I want to start with you because we all just sort of established that it's happening behind the meter. The level of knowledge people have on that might vary a bit to bit. So just as a baseline for the conversation, what's going on behind the meter that everyone needs to be paying attention to?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's fairly broad, and it depends on what customer segment you're looking at. But I guess you could kind of categorize it as there's people putting in their own generation assets behind the meter. It could be a backup generator. It could be as simple as a backup generator or a cogen unit. Cogen has been going on for quite a while. There is data monitoring systems going in that customers are using, and probably starting from the large corporates and coming down. And then I think what you're seeing more recently, say in the last couple of years, is you're seeing people take solar on the rooftop, which has been a hot trend, certainly in the residential space and commercial industrial, and they're pairing it with a battery, and then they're also linking it with how do they use and consume energy and putting all of those things together. And these are things that if you looked back 5-10 years ago, you technically could have done it. I don't think you could have done it cost effectively, and you couldn't have done the computing and the optimization now the way you could have done like 10 years ago. So that's to me what I really see going on. So there's definitely behind the utility meter for those running the network, there's less visibility as to what's going on behind that meter. In the past, it was kind of you could kind of project it was a fairly static load or it had a shape to it. Now customers are playing with their load shape to reduce demand charges or even turn off temporarily for other reasons. And it makes it much more harder for the utility to figure out what's the load on the grid over time.
And Tom, you and Blue Pillar work on doing networking behind the meter. So where are the opportunities there, not just for businesses like yours, but also for utilities looking to figure out what their customers are up to?
Sure, yeah. So, we've been selling to the largest C&I customers in the world for the last 12 years and are happy to call many of the largest hospitals, universities, military bases in the U.S. our customers. And one of the biggest things we see is their actual goals are pretty simple. Most of the time when you walk in and talk to a senior leader at one of these facilities, they'll tell you we want to become more energy efficient, energy resilient, and sustainable. Those three things. So why is it so hard, right? If it's just those three things and they can pretty much talk to those things pretty easily, why is it so difficult? The challenge is, and Eric can speak to this more than us, is the service providers have generally been stuck on commodity electricity, and the most advanced ones offer 80-20 splits in demand response. And those have been the primary two mass market adopted energy services that the customers understand. And they generally understand them by this time. The challenge is, how do you take what's next and message around that in a way that is actually compelling, right? In a way that actually is understandable. Because one of the shocking statistics that we heard from these folks is that the average facility operator spends about 80% of their time in break-fix mode. So literally, they don't think about energy. As a matter of fact, how many of you in this audience are from a facility? Zero. I suspected zero, right? None of you run a large facility, a commercial industrial facility. And that's the challenge. 80% of your time when you wake up is worried about a light bulb going out or fixing something on a maintenance level. You're spending 20% of your time thinking about anything new, and hopefully 20% of that time is talking about energy, right? So think about how little mind share and bandwidth we actually get as an industry inside these large facilities. And so I think the challenge is, how do people like Eric come up with new services that is actually going to allow them to buy? And that's still a major issue, I think, that this industry has not solved, is customer acquisition beyond commodity and demand response is very, very challenging.
Yep. Matt, we talked about we talked at the top of this about the rate of adoption slower than it needs to be. Tom spoke to some of the challenges there. What having your perspective from both sides of the meter, what are some of the other challenges to adopting the necessary technologies? So
the same customer you were talking about, you have him pull out his top drawer, and he's going to have 20 business cards in there from 20 different companies that say, I want to be your trusted energy advisor. Right? And the reality is not one of those people actually can solve all the problems. Right? If you look at the three of us, and we were actually joking about it on the prep call, we'd be a good partnership. Right? Because I have some engineering expertise, you have some application expertise, and you have the software information expertise. That's a pretty interesting, compelling offering to a series of, so what could we all do better together and stop trying to do ourselves to move the market forward faster? Then the only other thing I would say, and this is not intended as an insult, but probably to be more provocative, if we had gone to this conference in 2010, would we have heard basically all the same shit we heard today and yesterday? And the reality is, climate change isn't stopping. And carbon and decarbonization is a mass scale problem that we can't solve with one-off examples. So we need to find ways to get together and solve these problems faster, quicker, better.
One is inclined to then ask,
Absolutely.
or else what? What happens 5 years down the line if this rate of adoption hasn't increased? What regrets will the customers and utilities of the future have? I guess this is sorry. I'll open that to the group. Anyone who's gaining to predict the future.
I mean, I think the biggest regret is that without this, I mean, there's obviously the climate change conversation that's going on, and I don't think, at least in the U.S., the federal government is going to be the answer for that problem. So at the end of the day, it's the private sector that's ultimately going to solve that in some fashion by making these things economically viable and easy to understand and to purchase. But that is a big challenge. And so, that's probably the biggest risk is at the end of the day, you're going to run much safer or much less safe hospitals, universities, much less resilient facilities, much less efficient, and all those things add up to, potential major catastrophic issues.
Yeah, I think one of the big things you're going to see is, we talk to communities that have very aggressive climate change goals, and they don't know how to get there, but they have the goal in hand, and I think some of them are going to find they're going to be way behind where they want it to be, and other things could be imposed on them at the state level that are not going to put them in a better position. For example, doing RFPs, tenders for large-scale renewables that actually destabilize the grid because they're not able to do things locally to help kind of balance the two. And I think you're going to find that in some situations. California's got those challenges now, but I think other communities could be there as well.
So if you're dealing with those challenges, but you've sort of got the issue that you were talking about, that it's hard to find exactly the right partnerships because you've got 100,000 business cards in your desk. How do you go about doing the appropriate planning in terms of partnership with the right companies or and also with your local utility? How do you go about planning for that?
I don't know. It's a really good question. I think the utilities have to be involved in all the jurisdictions as a proactive partner. So you need to build a pretty broad base of answers there. There are different utilities that are more aggressive and are willing to bend the rule book than others. Mary Powell and Green Mountain Power is a great example of that. She takes huge risks and asks for forgiveness later. You heard the guy from Baltimore Gas and Electric say the same thing this morning. So I would look for utilities that are willing to bend the rules a bit and be progressive. You need data solutions is a huge part of the answer. There's only a handful of players that actually have proven technology in that. And then you need application experts. And then you need bodies. So you need companies that just have people they can throw at it. And then you have to have a lot of people that are willing to split the pie and not just take their unfair share of it. Because these are not economically huge answers that, there's tons of money flying around. These are scalable problems only if we look to do it in economically feasible ways.
And so that's one of the ways to address planning in the partnership area. But Tom, how can planning be done better for integration?
Integration. Well, so I speak specifically behind the meter. So,
right.
And again, so that's our perspective. But I came from a company before Blue Pillar that was selling to utilities, regulated utilities, for 10 years. And one of the things that was really shocking to me when I took over as the CEO of Blue Pillar was how different behind the meter integration and application procurement was done. So for the utility folks in the room, you can never imagine in the world that we lived on the regulated side where a meter vendor of hardware would only work with their own network, would only work with their own OSI soft application, and would only work with their own meter data management platform, right? As utilities, you would say, no chance will that ever occur in my lifetime where the hardware, the network, the data historian, and the app had to all work in one proprietary way for you to procure, right? But if you look at every single facility-based network and application, that's exactly how they purchase today, right? You have a building automation system installed by the building automation vendor with a networking capability that only works with it, that is proprietary in that way, and that does not share its data with anyone else in any fashion that's easy to do. So imagine now you have this networking paradigm where you have very application, vertically connected networks, hardware, applications, and that's the way every single commercial and industrial facility, at least, has procured for the last 25 years. And what we're trying to do at Blue Pillar is to go in there and say, there's a better way. Build one network for your facility, connect your meters, generator switches, storage devices, everything in one network, and then open that data and control layer up to anybody that you will allow to use it for whatever reason they can create value for you. And if you can do that, then when Shell walks in and says, hey, I want to sell you a new service, there's a potential that down the line a hospital can say, hey, no problem, we have all the data you need for that service available to us in a bus, and you can plug right into that and pull that data, and you have to do no integration. And oh, by the way, we're using that data already to do energy management on our own before you got here because we needed to do that, or to do workforce automation, right? So they want it for other reasons that, again, energy service companies thinking out of the box we think can take advantage of. But that's not the way it happens today. We're doing a lot of evangelizing right now.
Eric, any other thoughts on integration?
No, I agree with Tom. I think you definitely, I think in some of the OEM area or some of the equipment from the OEMs, there has to be some consolidation. There's a lot of startups and early stage companies that kind of look the same and doing a lot of the same. So I think there's going to have to be a roll up of the kit. And then I think with companies like what Tom is doing is being able to provide a platform to work with others and keep that to a manageable number of key partners for clients out there. Because I think when you have this, hundreds of different vendors and advisors and energy companies out there, and the drawer full of business cards, it just makes it really difficult for people to know how do I know who to talk to and how to work and make something happen. That's the real challenge.
So we've talked a lot already about behind the meter opportunities and also different changing and planning for partnerships and for integration. Before we get into the next thing about about the relationships of utilities and the energy ecosystem, I was wondering, just for the sake of dialogue, if anyone has any preliminary questions about anything we've covered so far. I see some hands.
Good.
You were there first, sir.
Sure, and it's on the heels of what was just answered. That was a good discussion about how do we get about integration. And Jim, you mentioned utilities, right, that are willing to take risks and try new things. No one mentioned the policymakers or the regulators.
I was just going to say.
And I think that, FERC tried, right? They had the NOPR counterpart to 841 on storage and said, we're going to do the DERs nationally. That kind of got shelved because a lot of states went in and said jurisdictional issues too hard, can't do it, right? What's your thoughts on it being almost like a neighbor level type of issue that the states need to get together, figure out those jurisdictional issues and allow that, participation? Because what we're talking about is being able to monetize that across, the entire stream into the wholesale market, right?
Yeah.
That's where we run into all these challenges, and you can't tap all those value streams and make the economics work.
Yeah, I think it's definitely got to be driven by the communities and up to the state level. I don't think you can rely on FERC. FERC and NERC and others are going to look at cybersecurity and some of the broader issues, but in terms of IoT and behind the meter with the grid, I think it's got to be at the state level.
I agree. I mean, New York Rev tried to do some of that, right? They were working on an open access platform, I think, statewide, and the utility.
States that have made some progress.
Right.
California, New York, single state.
Right.
Where the ISO and the
State coincide, yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, my personal opinion is we talk a lot about utilities. doing great work. We talk a lot about examples. The regulatory reform is not keeping pace and helping those utilities to do it. And in my opinion, it is an issue that NARUC or somebody is going to have to get involved in and try to pressure some regulatory reform.
And, we a little anecdotal story of how, best intentions, and one of the panelists just on the last panel talked about this, best intentions sometimes backfire. So we were being pulled in for literally a decade from hospitals and universities to purchase our system to connect all of their emergency power fleet for the purposes of automating the testing required of them by the regulators on a monthly basis, JCO commission compliance testing, right? So they would purchase, the facility themselves would purchase our network to connect their generation assets for the purpose of doing that in an automated way. They were paying for that through emergency demand response programs, which allowed them to enroll those generators in emergency DR situations where the utility, or the ERCOT in this case, was literally saying to them, we are in deep trouble. We need you, Mr. Hospital, to go to island mode. You're one of the only facilities in the entire footprint that can. But now we're going to remove the incentive for you to enroll that because the generators are diesel gen sets and they're dirty, right? So now you had an entire reason why new connectivity, new innovation in these facilities was being done, taken away because of a misunderstanding about actually how that should really operate. Those diesel gen sets are coming on no matter what. As soon as you go brownout or blackout, they're starting on their own. So why is this such a problem? It's because, candidly, people like us, we don't see the forest through the trees in some cases, and that's an example where the EPA stepped in and they've made it almost impossible to do that now, and it's a challenge in certain markets without retrofits and other things, right? You got to spend enormously on retrofits to get that same benefit.
Thank you for the question. I believe we had a couple over here.
Yeah, I just had a question about the number of actors. This is the short question. And to get to the scale, I think on scale, are there too many actors to really ultimately get to make it behind the meter? Realize this will actually monetize value across multiple markets, or is it okay and it'll work itself out? Because ultimately, what's the view? What's the point of view of these three? Too many players, or is there some inevitability on consolidation?
Well, I think in terms of those who can provide, there's a lot of players, and I think that'll happen. The market will solve that part of the too many players. But I think when it comes to the decision of a customer deciding to put something in, there's probably too many stakeholders that are preventing this from moving faster. So there is the utility plays a role in some of this, the service provider, the platform providers. So I think getting it down to a smaller, manageable number of stakeholders to make these things happen over time is what you need, and probably focusing on bigger plays for scaling and for having impact. It's focusing on community level as opposed to just an individual household.
Mine goes actually towards what Tom was saying a second ago, about how for some of these commercial customers it's great to have a single platform, but for all these commercial customers that already exist that don't have a single platform, is there a solution for them currently?
Yeah, so first and foremost, again, we come from their perspective. We don't generally had historically not sold to utilities. We had sold to their biggest customers. And the very first thing we'll tell you is they're not innocent bystanders anymore. The days of them waiting for the utility to solve their problems are over, especially in the large C&I. Almost every one of them is either within their payroll now or moving to hire local professional energy managers or hiring folks like Jim to be their professional energy managers and things like that, to consulting firms. So all of them are taking matters into their own hands to some extent. Now, the issue is they don't have the bandwidth to do that and to understand all those business cards and everything that comes in. And to Eric's point, we think consolidation does help with that. The ability for, just like in the telecommunications business, there used to be CLECs that would be competitive local exchange carriers, and the big telecommunication kind of companies like outlasted them and outweighed them. We think the same thing's going to happen in this space on the retail side. But these C&I customers, especially the big ones, and the multi-chain retail shops, right, Starbucks and those folks, are not waiting for people to solve their problems, right? So we think that will continue, and I think the race here, we always talk about the race being between utilities, kind of new innovative ESPs. I think the third participant is the facilities themselves. And again, if they don't need you for anything but commodity electricity and maybe enrollment in the demand response program, and they've already invested in efficiency, on-site generation, all that, then what's the market for new energy service companies? And people think, well, that's crazy, that could never happen. Well, there's hundreds of gigawatts of distributed generation in facilities today. They just happen to burn diesel. They've already invested on their own on-site distributed energy resources. We just don't like to call them those because they burn gas instead of take solar or wind. But they've done it already, so why aren't they going to do it again?
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yep. I kind of want to jump off of that into the next thing we wanted to cover, which was the relationship between between C&I customers and between the utility. Although Tom, you've phased out the use of the word utility in your business. Can you go in a little bit into that?
Yeah, I mean, we just stopped using the word, mainly because we just think it doesn't apply anymore to this new paradigm. So we tend to call everybody, including regulated utilities, and I know that the regulator would probably not like this term, but energy service providers, because at some point they are going to realize that they're providing a service. And I think Shell is a shining example of what an energy service provider is really going to look like in the future. It's how do you offer retail, competitive, distributed energy resource integration projects, microgrids, demand response, clearly all of these new things. And the question is the regulated side of the utility really going to be where the innovation is? I mean, I would argue in many ways that the retail side of the utility or the unreg side could be an area where, and certainly in Europe this is starting to happen, where you have complete deregulation, right? Where the retail side is one of the most advanced and most innovative. And so for us, we do focus on the retail side. Anybody that wants to go win a C&I customer is a customer of ours. So our value proposition to Shell and those folks would be, if you're launching a new service, let us be your Intel Inside connectivity platform so that we can make it easier when you win that customer project. But we don't call them utilities, clearly, because I don't think that applies anymore.
Jim, what is this new energy ecosystem going to look like then? If there's the utility is taking on a new form as this energy service provider, what's that going to look like, and who's planning for it now?
So first thing I would say is I saw Ernie Moniz speak about a month ago, and he said if anybody tells you they know the answer to that question, they're full of shit. So I will not tell you I know the answer to that question.
Fair enough.
You just know it's different.
I just know it's going to be different. I mean, when you look at the regulatory models and the evolution, I think there's going to be three distinct options. One is going to be the utility as a backbone, right, where independent third-party providers are actually providing the innovative retail services, and the utility becomes basically a pipes and wires construction company behind it. The second is where they take some role in it, but also are only a part of the ecosystem. They're not in control of it. And then the third option is they become the energy service provider. I personally don't think that model works. I don't think the utilities have a history of innovation, the talent, the culture to be able to do that sustainably. And I think you're better off allowing that to happen with just market solutions. I look at like EVs as an example, and I love all the utilities that got the investment for EVs, but my personal opinion is that's a market solution the market's going to way outpace a utility's ability to do it. They're going to know where to put the charging station. It's just, you don't need the utilities to play a role, in my opinion, other than rate design. And so I'm probably a little bit controversial on that, but I think there's three distinct options, and they'll all play out different states at different times.
And that's very interesting. Eric, as we talked about, the relationships are changing, and nobody's entirely blameless here. Not innocent bystanders anymore, I believe, is what Tom said. So, how do we create new partnerships between the new phase of the energy service provider, C&I customers who can't spend all their time thinking about energy, and companies like all of yours?
Yeah, I think the utility or the the wires distribution company has got to be a part of that. And I think the partnerships you set up has got to be with the platform providers. And I, kind of going back to the prior comment, I agree with your layout of the three. I think it's, it's the first and the second. And I think where the partnerships can come into play when you think about behind the meter, it's being able to present to the wires company that's managing the integrity of the infrastructure a way to control that network, much like in the unregulated markets, the ISOs operate the transmission grid. I think that's where things will play out. So I think it's getting the energy providers that go to the customer with the connectivity vendors and partners, and those doing some of the engineering work and coming together and then offering it as a solution that can then work with the bulk grid. I think that's how this will play out over time.
So, but I guess what I'm curious about, since we talked at the very beginning about how like urgent issues are and how leaving things as they are with the adoption rates as slow as they are, things can like at the very least get a lot less efficient and less sustainable, and people are sort of in their own camps, figuring out the solutions to these problems in their own way. How does the gap get bridged into that next ecosystem? Who should be pushing the hardest? Who should be initiating? That might be a tricky question, but
yeah.
I'm curious.
I mean, Starbucks just announced yesterday they did 350 stores worth of solar in Texas, right?
Yep.
Is that right? Did I get the stats right?
Yep.
So I think if you look at any transition, big companies have always led. You know what I mean? They have the resources and they have the power to be able to drive change. So, Walmart, doing a sustainability initiative and driving it through a supply chain, those types of things are the things that facilitate change, and then we're just partners to that as it moves itself along. We're working on a deal with a big grocery store chain where we're going to do natural refrigeration for all their grocery stores. That's a deal that we would have had to do through 52 utilities. You know what I mean? Over 10 years, we go to the head of procurement, and they want to do a deal with us and help them move the whole system. So I think big companies are a huge part of the answer.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that's the catalyst. And I think it's going to be up to companies like ours to be able to create. You have to listen. I mean, it's an overused word. You listen to the customer, but you got to put something together that's relevant and contractually easier to put together. Some of these things can be contractually a mess. Multiple counterparties, and you end up getting completely bogged down in multiple contracts. So I think that's the other trick is not only what works for the customer and the customer's driving what you want or what they want, but contractually how do you put this together with the different partners that makes it easy for the customer. I mean, it hasn't been solved. I mean, it's still a work in progress.
The other interesting point is we get money into this, meaning financing, scalable financing solutions into some of these answers. That always moves markets faster.
Yeah.
So we've got just about shy of 10 minutes left. I would like to open it up once more for questions if anyone has any questions about these. Yes, sir?
My question is about how customers buy. And as we're getting more complex set of services and more complex set of technologies, and these people don't have a lot of time or focus on this anyway, we're sort of at this mismatch, right? Complexity going up, time and understanding going down. How do we get these customers to buy in a way and really understand what the ROIs are for their personal decisions to make this easy?
Can I?
Yeah,
we were actually just talking about that this morning at
absolutely.
breakfast. I think part of it is it's incumbent on us to go to a client and know their industry and know what we think is important to them, and to be able to come up with something that does pencil out. It makes sense, economically makes sense, whether it's controlling, reducing costs, whether it's greening, whether it's some resiliency benefit, and not having the client have to sort through the materials to understand that. I think that's a key piece of it.
Yeah, and from our perspective, we think it's the only thing really separating this industry right now from big moves, and I'll talk about what I mean by that, is a conviction associated with what new services and new capabilities are going to be acquired. Because I think as soon as somebody figures out the recipe, then there are going to be things done in regards to consolidation in this industry that we don't even really expect. I mean, it's all fun and games until, and I know nothing and I have not heard anything, but till Shell buys Honeywell. Right, as an example, right?
That's a good idea.
That is a good idea.
All of a sudden, everybody in this room would say,
That's just a joke.
right, I completely, yeah, safe harbor for a private, we are private, so I can say anything I want here. But you get my point. It's all fun and games until NG buys, Schneider.
Yeah.
Right? Now what are we talking about here? What
Yeah.
the heck is this industry at that point in time? Well, it's an industry that comes service provider with the one or two or three most trusted suppliers that already are there: Siemens, Schneider, Honeywell, Johnson Controls. Those are the four guys they buy from today. They buy a lot of stuff from those four guys. Those guys dabble in energy already. They don't say they're competing with Shell, right? Although Honeywell would probably say they do demand response and other things. But at the end of the day, I don't think we've seen we haven't scratched the surface on the big moves that are going to happen. And again, it comes down to what are the convictions that are going to make you go write that type of check, right? And the convictions are, I have found a recipe for how the customers want to engage with me, and now I need to buy market share. I need to do a land grab. And the land grabs are done in big ways. It just hasn't happened yet. We don't believe in this industry. And I'm talking big moves, not small moves.
We have a question right here.
From the customer's point of view, what are they looking for? Because you guys already talked that the majority of the time, the customer themselves doesn't have time to think about these things. So what are they looking for?
I think it's what Tom had said earlier. I think in a lot of cases, even with all the technology changes and all the the solar and everything else that's out there, they still want predictable costs. They don't have to worry about it. They want to know. They don't want to wake up one month and see a bill and they say, how did that happen? They want to know if their operations are off spec and it's creating an operational issue and an energy issue. They want to be alerted and it becomes solved. In the tech area, there's all the talk about how do you reduce the frictions to buy, right? I think we have to have the same kind of mindset in energy. How do we reduce the frictions to making it easier for the customer to get what they want? There's the buzzword of energy as a service, and I think a lot of us are trying to do that. How do we just make this completely seamless? And it starts with knowing up front, this is a customer that values resiliency. It could be a supermarket, or this is a customer that wants to find a manageable way to get a carbon reduction over time. How do you do that in a way that doesn't hurt their economics? And you do it for them, and they trust you. And how do you put that all together? That's the trick.
Just two incremental points, I think. If you go to like SAP or Google or Apple, right, they want sustainable solutions because that's a recruiting tool for them, for their employees. And it becomes a differentiator. So they want 100% clean energy, and they want to know where their electrons come from. They don't want just RECs anymore. They want to physically know that the electrons they're getting are clean. And then the other customer segment we don't talk about a lot, but I think is really important, is the underserved. Poor or underprivileged communities. And if this system isn't managed correctly, the cost of the system is going to be pushed onto that customer segment. Because everybody that can buy their Tesla, put their battery in, and put solar on the roof is going to go off the grid. Yep. And then there's going to be a whole set of customers that still have to pay all that infrastructure cost. And to me, we as an industry need to make sure they're protected, and or we're going to have a lot of waste.
We've got a question in the back there.
Yeah, just a little bit of a pile on, but just try to flip it a little bit. What will have to change about customer behavior for this to finally take off? I feel like we've been punching at it for 20 years. But just from a customer perspective, what has to change about their behavior to allow you to sell your value proposition?
So there's an example in Europe. I think they put a $4 tax on gas a gallon, right? Somewhere in Europe, it finally got gas miles driven down. If you look at the price of electricity, the real price of electricity compared to GDP, it basically hasn't changed in 25 years, right? So they're, and the uses of energy, so it used to be, only 20% of the population had an air conditioner, and now 90 have one. You plug in your iPhones and your plasma TV, so the relative price use curve hasn't hit a point where they give a shit, to be honest with you. So you have to do something to exacerbate that problem in a congested area, so instead of allowing the utility to just build more pipes and wires, you need to find a way to price or tax or cost effectively create answers that create the opposite behavioral change. And I just don't think we've seen the price equation tie itself out to where anybody cares.
Yeah, I hate to be that guy, but I'm going to agree with Jim on this one. I mean, at the end of the day, people don't buy solutions, they solve problems. And the question is, are any of the customer problems big enough for them to do anything about them right now? At the end of the day, right now, a large facility generally gets highly reliable power at price points that don't kill their business generally, right? And they haven't had a big enough concern about sustainability and carbon put on them for any reason, right? There's no tax, there's no cost to it, it's only if you're a good steward. So at the end of the day, what problem are they actually solving? We have more and more facility customers that come to us to solve operational manpower problems that have additional energy benefit, like for example, monitoring diesel gen sets and then enrolling them in demand response. Demand response was the secondary benefit. It wasn't the primary reason. They wanted to stop walking around with clipboards and checking dipsticks on fuel tanks. That was their primary reason for investing. But you get the point. I think I'm with Jim. I mean, there has to be further and further catalyzing events where they're going to solve problems instead of because nobody's buying solutions. That's just not how we buy as consumers. We solve problems we don't even recognize that exist, but we solve them.
I'm optimistic. I think
Are you saying we're pessimistic?
Yeah.
I think?
No, I'm
Just kidding.
optimistic about the adoption. I think things are actually changing. If I look back over the last 5 years compared to 20 years, I think the big companies are leading the charge, and I think one thing they're going to do is they're going to look back in their supply chain and they're going to mandate these things. It's happening, we're seeing it, but it's going to continue to push through. But they're also going to become a role model for how these partnerships can work and how you can scale this out, and then how do you bring it down market. And so I think with the large companies, the Fortune 500's doing it, that's to me the catalyst.
And the state level. The
And the
state level is
Local.
helping because there's some local stuff in New York City. There's local stuff that's happening that are creating those problems, but it's not national at this stage. It's very local.
At some point with I'll use two examples: smoking and recycling. It flipped, right? The social consciousness became I need to recycle, not the opposite, right? So we just all have to work together to push the social consciousness so that it can flip, the same way those two markets did.
We had one more question right over here.
Cheryl Basso. I'm with PJM Interconnection.
Yep.
And as the grid operator, utilities and energy service providers are essentially our customers. Is there anything that you would want from...
Oh my God, I love you.
You have an hour?
That you would want from or would like to see coming from our side, from the grid operators, that would help facilitate some of the implementation of DER resources, sustainable resources, and things like that?
Can I try?
Sure.
So,
Entertain anything.
and I don't know PJM as well as I know ISO New England, but when you get high penetration of solar, so Vermont's about 30%, you get it spread across the state. What happens is the grid gets completely upside down. In Vermont, the peak is now 9 o'clock at night, okay? So if you think about customer behavioral programs and the flow of electrons, electron is worth a lot more money in one part of the grid than it is on another. And the way I think PJM and ISO New England and the other ISOs manage it, they have these big broad nodes. They have price points that I need the nodes to be closer in. I need it as local as you can possibly get it, so that we can actually price electrons and have differentiated models in different parts of the state where the system is actually failing. How'd I do?
No, that's good. I think more granularity around the data. I think, the NOPR that was brought up earlier is how do you implement the NOPR and recognize the value of things behind the meter to the grid, and accelerating that would be helpful.
Well, we're about out of time, but I want to thank our panelists, and I want to thank all of you for coming in and asking great questions. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and please come talk to them because especially about more grid operator stuff. Thank you all very much.
There you go.